This is Rick Goodrich, your Chief of Safety and Security for Bernie ISD, and you're listening to The Ascent with Crestmont Private Wealth.
The opinions expressed are those of the host. The material is for informational purposes only. It does not constitute investment advice, and it is not intended as an endorsement for any specific investment. Visit crestmontpw.com for more details.
You are listening to The Ascent with Crestmont Private Wealth. This is Alec Walker coming to you from our Houston office recording studio. Last time I was on the airwaves here, we were talking briefly about markets. I'm going to touch a little bit on the markets today. At the very end, we touched on the SpaceX IPO and just kind of some thoughts and things around that. And, so far, still early on in the process, but it looks like our predictions are kind of panning out. We had that initial pop in that share price, a lot of supply, demand acting there from investors, but now that price is going to come back down close to the initial IPO level. So we'll see where that shapes out going forward. But, it's interesting to follow that storyline. And, markets are interesting in general. As Sam was on here last week talking a bit about our investment philosophy in light of our recent rebalance, I wanted to touch on that a bit more in depth. We're obviously in the middle of World Cup fever. Houston is the host city of the World Cup. We've got the Fan Fest going on in East Downtown near the Dynamo Soccer Stadium. We had the Dutch fans from the Netherlands were in town over the weekend, and they had a huge march from Rice University out to NRG Stadium, or Houston Stadium as it's called, for the tournament. Early Saturday morning, we had, people from Houston, watching from their houses, giving out water because, of course, they may not be used to the hot, humid Houston heat. But it's just been, following some of these stories on social media of, fans coming to Houston and coming to Texas and experiencing Buc-ee's for the first time, where I think there was stories about Japanese fans overdoing it on the chips and dip at a Tex-Mex restaurant, where they got too full before the main course arrived, which of course, as we know in Texas, it's a rookie mistake. You got to save room for the main course to get your enchiladas and fajitas. But it's just been lots of positive stories of, people from overseas coming to experience our country and really having a great time. And hopefully a lot of that, Southern hospitality and American hospitality is coming through. So obviously, really excited about the USAL played their third match tonight, and then looking forward to, I think, July 1st, a week from today, be playing in the first game of our knockout round. So looking forward to that. But, we're talking about all these countries from overseas. Well, how does that relate to investing in our investment portfolio? Well, I think it's a great time to talk about diversification in our portfolios. We talk a lot about diversification across U.S. markets, and we have a lot of conversations with clients that may hold concentrated positions in their company stock that they're granted through RSUs or stock options, or maybe they're inheriting concentrated positions from their parents or loved ones and trying to formulate a diversification plan for that. And of course, you can, diversify from one company to 25 companies to 500 companies with the S&P 500, or you could diversify across thousands of companies in the whole global diversification pool of investments and pool of businesses. So wanted to touch a little bit on that. Within our core investment portfolios that we manage, we do take a globally diversified approach. I mentioned on our last episode about how if you just invested in the S&P 500, 40% of your investment is in those top 10, the largest companies in the U.S. market. But when you factor in all the additional diversification we have from global diversification, asset class diversification, that concentration for our core portfolios for those top 10 companies drops to about 23%. So, maybe for some of you that aren't aware, what does the global diversification look like? So we'll start with the equity markets. The United States currently makes up about, as of the end of 2025, about 62% of the global equity market in terms of its market cap. Represents about 3,400 companies. Compared to international markets, you've got another 6,500 in developed ex-US markets. So think about Europe, the UK, Canada, Japan, Australia. Those are developed international markets. And then another 11,000 companies in emerging market economies. So think China, Korea, Taiwan, India, Brazil, all these different areas of the economy. So if we're just investing in only US companies, we're only getting exposure to 62% of the global economy. Now, most of our clients, live and work and will retire in the US. And so we do have a home country bias. We don't simply look at here's the current market valuation of the globe, it's 62% US. So we only want to put 62% of our client assets in the US markets. No, that's not the case. We're going to be biased a little bit overweight towards US economies, towards US companies as well. But we do want to have that global exposure, not only for that geographical diversification, but also for some returns diversification as well. And I'll look at some of those data points today on what that diversification brings. So that's on the equity side of things. And then the same thing is prevalent on the bond market. And that's actually a little bit more extreme. The United States only represents 41% of the market cap in global bonds. So China and Japan represent 10% each. Germany, France, and the UK combined to be around 10 to 15%. So even when you're talking about the fixed income markets as well, think about retirees that maybe have a larger allocation to bonds, the US is only a 41% allocation in that space. And so that's why we also hold and invest in international bonds as well, get that global diversification there. Now, going back to the equity markets, there's this really great chart. We kind of call it the periodic table of returns or the quilt returns, looking at all these different international countries going all the way back to 2005 and looking at which of the highest annual returns and which have the lowest annual returns. And of course, it's completely random. You can't predict year to year which country is going to be the highest performer. But it's really interesting. If you look over the last few years, the highest performing countries have been starting in 2024 and going backwards: Singapore, Italy, Portugal, Denmark, New Zealand, Finland, and Australia. The US hasn't been the top performing country since 2014. So it's been 12 years since then. Denmark has had the largest annualized return going back from 2005 to 2024. Denmark has averaged an 11.2% annualized return compared to the US's 9.8% return. So just kind of interesting there. Most of the time we're not trying to specifically pick certain countries and sectors, but by having exposure to developed and emerging markets, we are getting bite-sized pieces of these different countries' returns. And when you look at the underlying holdings of those areas, you may think, oh, Denmark, what's that? Well, the largest holding in the Denmark stock market is a company called Novo Nordisk, a very large healthcare research drug company. Sam mentioned on our investment philosophy, we're investing in businesses. And when you look at the international market, some of the largest holdings right now are based out of Korea. Korea's probably been the top country performer a year to date or over the last 12 months. If you look at their largest holdings, you've got Samsung Electronics, a less well-known company, but becoming more well-known. SK Hynix is a semiconductor company. So they've obviously had a lot of growth over the last few years. Then you've got companies like Shell, Nestle, Novartis, AstraZeneca, some medical and healthcare companies. So we want that global exposure to get that diversification in other areas of the market. And it's not just diversification for diversification's sake. There's some data around, risk of overconcentration in one geopolitical sector that we can take a look at as well. You're listening to The Ascent with Crestmont Private Wealth. This is Alec Walker, EVP of Financial Planning, talking about geopolitical, global diversification across our portfolios and looking back to some recent data, and then we'll step a little bit further back in time as well. So we want that global diversification because, in certain times, these other countries can outperform. We've been on a very recent run the last 10 to 15 years. The S&P 500 has been the place to invest. But if we go back over the last 16 months or 18 months to the start, January 1st of 2025, the S&P 500 is up about 27% total return. But if you look at the Russell 2000, which is the US small cap index, It's up 36% since that time frame. International developed markets, so Europe, Japan, Asia, that index as a whole is up 42%. And then emerging markets, which is going to include some of those, Taiwan Semiconductor, some of those chip companies, up 67% over the last 18 months since the start of 2025. So even in the near term, we've started to see a little bit of rotation there. And that's why, we talked about it a few weeks ago in our recent rebalance, wanted to trim a little bit of our US exposure to get a little bit more broad diversification. But if we go back even further in time, it's been a while since we've talked about this. It's becoming further and further in the past. We tend to forget about it. But the lost decade from January 1st of 2000 to December 31st of 2009. So think about if you had retired in January 1st of 2000, the S&P 500 actually had a annualized negative 0.78% return over that 10-year period. Meaning if you invested in the S&P 500, hey, I'm getting diversification in the US stock market, you would have lost money over that 10-year period. Now, had you had a diversified portfolio, maybe you included some bonds. Well, bonds were up 82% over that 10-year period. Actually, a pretty solid annualized return there for fixed income, considering we went through, 2 recessions. We had the tech bubble in the early 2000s, and then we had, of course, the great financial crisis at the end of that decade. But even during those time periods, the Russell 2000 small cap US stocks were up 48%. International developed stocks were up 26%. And then emerging markets stocks were up 194% over that 10-year period. This was a lot of that growth in China, GDP growth. The China economy was really booming during this period. So had you had a more globally diversified, more asset class diversified portfolio during this period, you would not have felt the pain versus having a single asset class portfolio. And that's why that kind of behavioral coaching that we provide to our clients is so important, because it's very easy, especially over the last 10 years, to think, hey, all I need to do is invest in the S&P 500 and everything else, will take care of itself. We've got this recent data showing that can be a negative. And sometimes we have to, we don't want to have that fear of missing out, where we just kind of go all in on what's working recently, what's been working. We want to zoom out and have a more diversified approach. That may cap our returns. We may miss some upside there. But when we're talking about long-term planning through to retirement, throughout retirement, and across multiple generations potentially, we want to also protect that downside risk. And sometimes, reducing our upside to manage that risk is something that we're willing to take for certain client situations. You've been listening to The Ascent with Crestmont Private Wealth. Alec Walker talking a little bit about global diversification as we're in the midst of a global event with the World Cup here in Mexico, the US, and Canada. I hope that you all continue to enjoy some of the stories that we're getting from the top soccer players in the world coming over here. We'll definitely be rooting on the US team as they take on Turkey tonight and their first knockout round next week. If you have any questions about Crestmont Private Wealth, you can visit our website at crestmontpw.com, and we look forward to talking with you again soon. Thank you.